Stone walls, narrow cloisters, and endless bells. Life in a medieval monastery was steady, silent, and severe. Behind the image of prayer and devotion lay cold cells, meager meals, and discipline that touched every hour. Children who entered as novices lost family, freedom, and play, their days broken into fragments of chant and labor. They rose before dawn, prayed in freezing chapels, and copied books until their eyes dimmed. Work filled the spaces between, and silence filled everything else. The monastery was meant to humble the body and purify the soul. But for those who lived inside, it was a life without comfort, without laughter, without choice. Tonight we walk slowly through that world, through cells of stone, through kitchens of smoke, through the unending rhythm of bells. Rest as you listen, and join us in the cloisters where childhood ended and obedience began. Cold stone and endless silence. The monastery was built of stone, heavy and gray. Its walls rose without warmth, shutting out the noise of the world and holding within a silence that pressed on the body. For those who entered as children or as grown men, life inside was steady, repetitive, and severe. To live there meant leaving behind comfort, family, and freedom. The day began in darkness. Monks were woken before dawn by the sound of a wooden clapper or the toll of a bell. The air was cold, the stone floors colder. Bare feet stepped onto flagstones damp with night. Candles flickered weakly, their smoke drifting into narrow halls. Voices rose in chant, low and steady, filling the chapel. Prayers lasted for hours, recited in Latin, a language most outside never understood. For children who entered as novices, the words were foreign at first, learned by repetition until they became second nature. Silence governed daily life. In cloisters, monks walked slowly, their eyes lowered. Speech was restricted, replaced by gestures or brief phrases when work demanded. Meals were eaten in silence as well, broken only by the sound of chewing bread and the voice of a reader reciting from scripture. Conversation was forbidden, laughter discouraged, and every sound measured. For children once used to noise, the stillness was heavy. Food was plain. Bread, beans, and vegetables formed most meals. Meat was rare, often forbidden, except for the sick. Fish replaced it on many days. The bread was coarse, the beans boiled into thick porridge, the vegetables soft from overcooking. Meals were meager, designed not to please but to sustain. Hunger was constant, a reminder of discipline. The work of the monastery filled hours. Some copied manuscripts, bending over desks in scriptoria lit only by small windows. Ink-stained fingers, eyes grew strained, and backs ached from long hours of stillness. Others worked in fields, tending crops, digging soil, or caring for animals. Labor was unending, shaped by the seasons, yet even in winter, there was no rest. Children joined this work early, learning to hoe fields, sweep cloisters, or fetch water. Cold marked the buildings. Thick stone walls held in damp. In winter, frost-coated windows, and breath hung in the air like smoke. Fires were few, often only in kitchens. Cells were bare, with straw beds and rough blankets. Monks slept fully clothed, shivering through long nights. Summer brought little comfort, for the thick walls trapped heat, and the air grew heavy. Punishment was part of discipline. Disobedience brought lashes, fasting, or long hours of prayer on bare knees. Children and adults alike were subject to correction. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many monasteries, demanded strict obedience. A novice who disobeyed risked humiliation before the community, forced to lie prostrate on the floor, or endure silence for weeks. Correction was constant, shaping bodies into order. Illness was common. Cold air, poor food, and long hours weakened bodies. The infirmary carried men suffering from fevers, coughs, and sores. Medicine was crude, herbs gathered from gardens or prescribed by tradition. Few recovered fully. The life of the cloisters shortened more lives than it extended. Prayer divided the day. 7 times. Monks were called to the chapel at dawn, at noon, in the evening, and even during the night. The hours blurred, marked only by bells. Sleep was broken. Rest never complete. Chanting in cold darkness left bodies weary, but prayers could not be missed. Each voice joined the others, rising and falling in unchanging rhythm. Contact with the outside world was limited. Monks rarely left the monastery, Novices who entered as children often never saw their families again. Letters were rare, visits rarer still. The walls separated them from villages and markets, cutting them off from life beyond. The silence of the cloister replaced the sound of home. Even moments of learning were strict. Boys who studied Latin, scripture, or music did so under watch. Mistakes were corrected with stern words or blows. Knowledge was granted slowly, piece by piece, through endless copying and memorization. The mind, like the body, was disciplined into obedience. At night, the monastery returned to darkness. Candles burned low, shadows stretched across stone walls, and silence deepened. Sleep came lightly, broken by bells calling men back to prayer. Each day repeated the last, without change, without end. The rhythm of the monastery was steady but unrelenting, pressing upon every child and every monk who lived within its walls. Bread without comfort. Food in a medieval monastery was not meant to please. It was measured, plain, and controlled by rules that tied eating to discipline. Hunger was constant, fasting frequent, and meals offered little relief. Children who entered as novices soon learned that to eat was not to enjoy but to endure. The rule of Saint Benedict guided most monasteries. It allowed 2 meals a day, one at midday, another at evening. Breakfast was rare, reserved for the weak or the very young. Each meal began with prayer, eaten in silence, and ended without speech. Monks sat in rows, eyes lowered, while a reader stood at a lectern, reciting from scripture. The sound of chewing mixed with the steady drone of Latin. For children used to noise, the stillness was heavy, broken only by the scrape of spoons and the crack of bread. Bread formed the heart of the diet. It was coarse, baked from barley, rye, or wheat, depending on what fields produced. The loaves were dense, their crusts hard. Monks tore them with effort, soaking them in broth or ale to soften them. Teeth wore down quickly, ground by grit left in flour. Even young mouths carried pain with every bite. Vegetables and legumes filled bowls most often. Beans, peas, onions, and leeks were boiled into thick stews. Flavor was minimal, salt scarce, spices nearly absent. Gardens within the cloister supplied these foods, tended daily by novices and lay brothers. The harvest marked the meals of the year, repeated without variation. Children carried baskets of onions or beans, their smell clinging to hands and robes. Fish replaced meat. In many monasteries, the eating of meat was forbidden, except for the sick. Even poultry was rare. Fish, fresh from rivers or salted from barrels, appeared instead. It was boiled, stewed, or dried until hard. The taste was sharp, the texture unkind. In coastal monasteries, herrings and eels were common. Inland, salted cod or carp-filled plates. The smell of fish lingered in halls, clinging to walls and garments. On feast days, meals grew larger, but only slightly. Extra bread, cheese, or fruit appeared, sometimes eggs or honey. Yet even these were given sparingly. Children might taste sweetness once or twice a year, never enough to forget hunger. For the wealthy monasteries, wine accompanied meals, diluted with water. In poorer houses, ale sufficed, brewed thin and sour. Fasting marked much of the calendar. Lent, Advent, vigils, and countless feast eves required abstinence. Entire days passed with little food, broken only by water or thin broth. Children struggled most, their stomachs empty, their limbs weak. Yet fasting was considered discipline, a way to humble flesh and purify spirit. Complaints were met with correction, and hunger was treated as a test of faith. Meals were not private but communal. Silence enforced equality. The abbot ate the same bread as novices, though his portion was larger. Leftovers were few. Waste was forbidden. Any crumbs or scraps were gathered, sometimes given to the poor at the monastery gate, sometimes eaten cold the next day. For children, there was no choice. Every bite had to be swallowed, whether liked or not. Illness followed such diets. Lack of fresh fruit and variety led to weakness. Records of monasteries describe outbreaks of scurvy, stomach sickness, and fevers tied to poor food. Novices fainted during prayers, their bodies thin from fasting. The infirmary held many suffering not from plague or wound, but from hunger. Food was also labor. Children helped grind grain, stir stews, carry water, and salt fish. Kitchens were hot, filled with smoke, their stone walls blackened by fire. The work was constant, repeating each day, as predictable as the meals themselves. Even in preparing food, joy was absent. The memory of taste faded, days passed in sameness. Bread, beans, and fish repeated until they blurred together. A child who entered young might live years without tasting meat, sweetness, or spice. Their bodies grew thin, their strength bent toward prayer and work, not toward health. In the monastery, food was not abundance. It was control. Hunger was not a flaw but a design. The body was kept lean, the spirit kept humble, and meals became another form of discipline. For children within the cloister, bread without comfort was all they knew. The weight of obedience. Life in a monastery was bound by discipline. Every act, from waking to sleeping, was governed by rules. For children who entered as novices, the weight of obedience fell heavily. Correction was constant, punishment swift, and freedom absent. The rule of Saint Benedict shaped much of this order. It demanded humility, silence, and submission. Monks were to obey their abbot as they would obey God. For novices, this meant every order was absolute. To hesitate was disobedience. To question was pride. The abbot's voice carried the weight of law, his judgment final. Silence was discipline itself. Conversation was restricted to what was necessary. At meals, speech was forbidden. In cloisters, only gestures were allowed. Novices who spoke without leave faced rebuke. Silence was meant to guard the soul, but for children, it was isolation. Days passed with few words, and loneliness pressed in. Punishment enforced order. The rod was common. Novices were beaten for disobedience, laziness, or mistakes in prayer. Records from monastic chronicles mention lashes given in chapter houses, where the community gathered. The offender knelt, confessed, and received blows before all. For children, the humiliation was as heavy as the pain. Fasting was also punishment. A novice might be denied his portion of bread or sent to eat alone on the floor. In severe cases, he might be excluded from meals entirely, left hungry while others ate. Hunger, already constant, became sharper under discipline. Labor served as correction. Boys who erred were assigned extra tasks, sweeping cloisters, cleaning latrines, or hauling water from distant wells. These tasks were heavy, their repetition wearing down body and spirit. The monastery taught through work as much as through words. Public confession deepened the sense of shame. In chapter meetings, monks admitted faults aloud. Novices stood before the community, naming their disobedience. Even small mistakes, like falling asleep during prayer, required confession. The ritual reinforced obedience, making each child aware that his life was observed and judged. Isolation was used for grave faults. A novice might be placed alone in his cell, denied speech, meals, or contact. The silence grew heavier in such confinement, the stone walls pressing close. For the young, this punishment carried fear. For companionship, however restricted, was essential to endurance. The body itself was treated as stubborn. Hard beds of straw, rough clothing, and cold water were all forms of discipline. Comfort was seen as danger. To deny comfort was to purify. Even children were expected to accept hardship as a path to holiness. Records of monastic life describe discipline without emotion. Chronicles note punishments as ordinary events, not cruelties. The intention was correction, not kindness. A boy beaten for disobedience was believed to be guided, not harmed. In such logic, pain was part of salvation. Obedience extended beyond rules to thought. Novices were taught to distrust their own judgment. Pride was condemned. To obey was to surrender the will. Even reading was controlled, assigned by teachers or abbots. Curiosity outside the permitted texts was discouraged. Minds, like bodies, were pressed into order. Punishments left marks. Some endured scars from lashes, others bent spines from constant kneeling, yet the discipline was not questioned. To endure was to learn. To suffer was to belong. For children, obedience became identity. Even when no punishment was present, the weight of rules shaped life. Bells rang, signaling prayer, meals, work, and rest. There was no hour unmarked, no moment ungoverned. The day belonged not to the child, but to the rule. The night was broken by vigils, forcing weary bodies to rise again. The monastery did not allow rebellion. Novices who resisted too strongly were dismissed, their vows refused. Others endured, bent slowly by discipline, until obedience became instinct. For some, this meant survival. For others, it meant despair. Obedience was the heart of monastic life. It pressed down like stone, heavy and cold. Children learned to accept it, or they broke beneath it. In every silence, every lash, every prayer whispered in the dark, the weight of obedience remained. Cells of stone. The monastery cell was not a place of comfort. It was small, bare, and cold, built to remind its inhabitant that life was not for pleasure. Children who entered as novices often shared these narrow rooms or slept in long dormitories, while older monks lived alone. Each space, whether shared or solitary, was marked by stone, silence, and the absence of warmth. Walls were thick, made of rough stone that absorbed the chill of winter and the damp of autumn rains. In summer, they trapped heat, leaving the air heavy. Windows, when they existed, were small, often no more than narrow slits. Light filtered weakly through them, casting thin beams across floors of packed earth or rough flagstone. Darkness remained constant, broken only by the flame of a candle. Beds were little more than straw pallets laid on the floor or on simple wooden frames. Straw flattened quickly, filling with insects, lice, and fleas. Blankets were rough wool, thin against cold air. Monks slept fully clothed, their robes their only protection. Children shifted restlessly, scratching at bites, pulling fabric tight against their bodies. Sleep was shallow, broken by bells calling them to prayer in the middle of the night. Furniture was scarce. A small wooden stool, a chest for few possessions, sometimes a crucifix on the wall. No ornament, no color, no decoration. The austerity was deliberate, meant to turn attention away from self and toward God. For the young, it meant emptiness. Their world narrowed to stone, straw, and silence. Cold was constant. Fires were forbidden in cells, allowed only in kitchens or infirmaries. Winter winds seeped through cracks in stone. Frost formed on walls. Breath hung visible in the air. Novices woke with stiff limbs, fingers numb, feet raw from chill floors. In some regions, snow drifted against the walls, pressing in silence against the cloister. Heat in summer brought no relief. The thick walls trapped warmth, turning cells into chambers of stifling air. Sweat-soaked robes, insects swarmed, and the smell of damp straw filled the room. Children lay restless, the stillness heavy, waiting for the bell that would call them from their beds. Noise was rare. Cells were places of silence. Only the faint sound of chanting from the chapel or the toll of a distant bell broke it. In dormitories, the quiet was disturbed only by coughing, shifting, or the mutter of dreams. For children who once knew village streets or family chatter, the absence of voices weighed heavily. Cleanliness was difficult. Floors were swept, straw replaced, but damp returned. Water for washing was scarce, carried in buckets from wells or rivers. Cold water splashed against skin in mornings, shocking the body awake. Robes, worn day and night, absorbed sweat and dirt, rarely washed. The smell of unwashed bodies filled dormitories, heavy in the stagnant air. Illness thrived in such conditions. Lice spread quickly. Fevers rose in winter's damp. Coughs echoed in dormitories, passed from child to child. The infirmary, small and poorly supplied, overflowed. Death was not rare. A boy might disappear from his bed one night and never return, his cell left empty for another novice. Possessions were forbidden beyond necessity. No toys, no trinkets, no color. Children carried only their robes, a blanket, and perhaps a wooden cross. The absence of objects emphasized poverty, yet it also deepened monotony. Days blended together when nothing changed. Not in cell, not in work, not in food. Even the act of sleeping was governed by rules. The rule of St. Benedict instructed that monks sleep clothed, with belts fastened, ready to rise at the bell. Beds faced the chapel, a reminder that rest itself was an act of discipline. Night was not escape, but preparation for more prayer. Cells of stone preserved obedience. They denied comfort, denied warmth, denied individuality. For children, they were cages without bars, spaces where silence pressed heavier than walls. Each night ended too soon, each morning returned to labor and prayer, and the cell remained the same cold, bare, and endless. Hours without rest. The monastery day was measured not by sun or season but by bells. Prayer divided the hours, breaking sleep, work, and meals into fragments. For children who entered as novices, the rhythm of prayer governed every movement. Life was not their own. It belonged to the hours of the church. The first bell sounded before dawn. It called monks from cold beds to the night office, known as matins or vigils. Darkness filled the chapel. Candles burned weekly, smoke rising into vaulted ceilings. Voices rose in chant, slow and steady, reciting psalms in Latin. The body still longed for sleep, yet the hours of prayer could not be missed. Children stood among older monks, eyes heavy, lips moving through words learned by repetition. After vigils came lauds, prayers at dawn. The faint light of morning entered narrow windows, gray and pale. Again, chants filled the air. Psalms repeated, verses recited. When prayers ended, monks returned briefly to their cells, only to rise again. The cycle of the day had only begun. Prime followed at the first hour after sunrise. Then terce, mid-morning. Sext at noon. None in mid-afternoon. Vespers at evening. Compline at night. 7 times each day, in addition to night prayers, the community gathered. Each service carried its own psalms, hymns, and readings. The hours repeated daily, unchanging, regardless of season or weather. For novices, the repetition was heavy. Latin was memorized but not understood. Voices droned together, rising and falling in monotone. Hours stretched endlessly, broken only by the toll of bells. Sleep was always shallow, broken by night prayers. Fatigue became constant. The body never fully rested. The chapel was cold in winter, its stone walls echoing sound but offering no warmth. Breath hung in the air as chants continued. In summer, the air grew stifling, incense thick, candles dripping wax onto stone floors. Children endured in silence, shifting on aching feet, their stomachs empty from fasting. Prayers were long. Matins could last for hours with dozens of psalms recited. Even the shorter hours stretched into length when chants slowed. Mistakes were punished. A boy who faltered in reading faced correction. A novice who drifted into sleep was struck awake or forced to kneel. Weariness did not excuse failure. Music carried monotony. Gregorian chant filled every hour, its tones steady, unchanging. For the young, it was both lull and burden. The rhythm of voices blended into one another until time itself dissolved. Days passed, not as distinct events, but as endless repetition of psalms and hymns. The rule allowed no escape. Prayer was the heart of monastic life. Work and meals were arranged around it, not the other way. A novice who wished for rest or play found none. Even in sickness, attendance was expected unless death drew near. Night brought no relief. After compline, monks returned to their beds, only to be woken again for vigils. Sleep came in fragments. 3 hours here, 2 hours there. Never whole. Children struggled most, their young bodies unprepared for such division. Exhaustion became permanent, pressing down heavier than hunger or cold. Prayer was meant to purify, to lift the soul beyond the body. For children, it was discipline. Lips moved, words repeated, bodies bent in bows and genuflections. Yet the meaning of the prayers often slipped away, hidden behind fatigue. The rhythm of bells ruled more than devotion itself. The hours also shaped space. Bells echoed through cloisters, their sound cutting through silence. They marked the day without fail. Even when no bell rang, the body remembered, rising by habit. Children grew into men whose lives were measured not by birthdays or seasons, but by the endless return of psalms. Archaeological remains of monastic schedules, written in manuscripts, confirm this strict order. Psalters worn smooth by fingers, margins filled with corrections, testify to endless use. Stone chapels, their floors hollowed by countless feet, show centuries of repetition. The weight of prayer left physical marks not only on men, but on the buildings themselves. For those within, prayer consumed life. Each hour folded into the next, unbroken, unchanging. For a child, the cycle was overwhelming. The bell called, the body obeyed, the voice chanted, and the day continued without rest. Work without end. Prayer filled the hours, but labor filled the spaces between them. A monastery was not only a place of devotion, but also of work. Fields had to be planted, animals tended, walls repaired, and books copied. For children who entered as novices, this meant days where the body never truly rested. Labor was as constant as prayer, and neither allowed relief. The fields belonged to the monastery. Novices and lay brothers worked the soil, turning earth with heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen. They planted barley, rye, and wheat, scattering seed by hand. In harvest season, they swung sickles through grain, their backs bent, their hands raw from repeated cuts. Children joined these tasks early, learning to carry water, gather weeds, and scare birds from crops. Sunlight beat down in summer, while cold winds cut through in winter. Gardens inside cloister walls demanded care as well. Vegetables, onions, leeks, beans, and peas were tended daily. Herb gardens grew plants used for medicine: sage, mint, fennel, and garlic. Children fetched water from wells, carried baskets of soil, and weeded narrow beds. Their small hands blistered from tools too heavy, yet they were expected to endure. Livestock needed constant attention. Monks raised sheep for wool, cows for milk, and chickens for eggs. Novices fed animals at dawn, cleaned stalls, and carried manure to fields. The smell of dung and hay clung to robes, mixed with sweat and smoke. In coastal monasteries, fish ponds and nets added to the work. Children mended nets, cleaned fish, and salted them for storage. Beyond farming, labor filled other spaces. Wood had to be chopped for kitchens. Wells dug deeper. Walls patched after storms. Novices hauled stones, mixed mortar, and carried timber. The sound of hammers echoed through cloisters, blending with chants from chapels. Every task was performed by hand, slowly, with effort repeated endlessly. Inside the monastery, scriptoria demanded different labor. Boys with promise in reading and writing bent over desks, copying manuscripts. Hours passed in silence, reed pens scratching across parchment. The ink stained their hands, their eyes strained in dim light. Mistakes brought correction, and patience was demanded. For some, this was easier than fields, but the stillness carried its own exhaustion. Laundry was another burden. Robes, coarse and heavy, were washed in cold water, beaten against stones. Novices carried them to rivers, scrubbing with ash or lye until fingers cracked. The garments never grew soft, only stiffer with time. Beds of straw were shaken out, floors swept, and cloisters kept free of dirt. Even cleaning became endless work. Seasons shaped labor. In spring, plowing and planting consumed time. Summer brought weeding, watering, and tending animals. Autumn meant harvest, long days cutting grain and storing it. Winter forced repairs, mending roofs, patching walls, and carrying endless wood for the single fires permitted. Children learned quickly that no season offered rest. Labor was tied to punishment. A novice who erred might be sent to latrines, scraping waste, or ordered to dig trenches alone. Extra work was correction, adding weight to already heavy days. The body became both tool and lesson, shaped by obedience through labor. Silence continued, even in work. Fields were quiet, save for the sound of wind and tools. Scriptoria held only the scratching of pens. Kitchens were filled with clatter, but voices were low. Conversation was not part of labor. The work itself was prayer, each act seen as service to God. For children, it meant loneliness stretched across hours. The toll on the body was visible. Calloused hands, bent backs, and weary eyes marked even the young. Illness spread through wounds and strain. Yet work was unrelenting. The monastery had to sustain itself, and every hand, however small, was needed. Labor was meant to humble. It stripped away pride, teaching obedience. Yet it also consumed life. Days blurred into fields, gardens, kitchens, and books, broken only by bells calling to prayer. For a child, the weight of work left little space for play, thought, or freedom. It was work without end, a rhythm as unchanging as the stone walls around them. Sickness in the cloister. Illness was constant within the walls of a medieval monastery. Cold air, meager food, damp stone, and endless work left bodies weak. For children who entered as novices, sickness was a companion as steady as prayer. Few grew into old age. Many died quietly in cells, their names entered in small records, their bodies buried in simple graves. The buildings themselves carried disease. Thick stone walls trapped damp. Winter frost lingered inside, while summer heat brought rot. Dormitories were crowded. Straw pallets filled with lice and fleas. Robes were rarely washed, their coarse fabric absorbing sweat, dirt, and insects. The air was heavy with smoke from kitchens, mixed with the odor of unwashed bodies. Coughs echoed through the cloister, spreading from child to child. Food weakened health further. Bread was coarse, filled with grit from grinding stones. Teeth wore down, gums bled, abscesses spread. Vegetables provided little variety. Fish carried parasites, and fasting left bodies thin. Novices fainted during long prayers, their strength drained. Malnutrition was not exception but routine, shaping the thin frames of children forced to endure. The cold worsened sickness. Fires were forbidden in most rooms. Only kitchens and infirmaries held warmth. Winter nights left novices shivering on straw, their breath visible in the air. Fingers cracked, feet froze, lungs weakened, colds turned to fevers to pneumonia. Many never recovered. Medical care existed but was limited. Monasteries grew herbs, sage, fennel, garlic, mint, and used them in simple remedies. Honey was applied to wounds, vinegar used to wash sores, garlic eaten for strength. Prayers accompanied every treatment. Spells and psalms were recited over the sick, blending faith with medicine. Yet knowledge of disease was small. Bloodletting was common, believed to balance the body's humors. Weak children grew weaker after the loss of blood. The infirmary was a place of silence. Rows of straw beds, bowls of broth, and the smell of herbs filled the room. Monks whispered prayers as they tended the ill. Children lay still, sweating with fever, their bodies wrapped in rough blankets. Some recovered slowly. Others faded, their breath shallow, their eyes closed. Death came quietly, marked only by a bell and a prayer. Plague was feared most. When pestilence swept through villages, monasteries were not spared. Chronicles tell of entire communities struck, dozens buried in days. Children, already weak, fell first. Black swellings, fever, and delirium spread through cloisters. Prayers rose louder, but few survived. Graves filled quickly, each marked with simple crosses, their names soon forgotten. Other diseases lingered longer. Skin infections spread in crowded dormitories. Worms and parasites weakened stomachs. Blindness came from untreated infections of the eye. Many monks, even young ones, lost sight, their eyes clouded by disease. For novices, this meant stumbling in cloisters, guided by others, their voices still expected to chant despite failing vision. Work injured as well as weakened. Tools cut hands. Accidents broke bones. Without proper care, wounds festered. A small cut could turn to infection, swelling red and spreading fever through the body. Limbs were sometimes lost, though amputation was crude and often fatal. For children forced into heavy labor, injuries were not rare. Death was not dramatic. It came in silence, in cold dormitories, in damp infirmaries, or in fields where a child collapsed. Bodies were washed, wrapped in linen, and carried to small cemeteries. Burials were plain, marked by wooden or stone crosses. Novices were mourned briefly. Then life in the cloister continued, unchanged. Records of deaths survive in monastic chronicles. Simple entries note names, ages, and causes when known. Many list only fever, weakness, or plague. The brevity reflects the routine of loss. For communities where dozens lived together, death was part of the rhythm. For children, it was a reality seen often and endured without pause. Faith explained illness as trial. Weakness of the body was meant to strengthen the soul. Pain was accepted as purification. For novices, this meant no complaint was allowed. To suffer silently was obedience. To die faithfully was victory. These beliefs offered meaning, but for children, they meant endurance without comfort. Archaeological remains confirm the toll. Skeletons from monastic cemeteries show curved spines from labor, worn teeth from coarse bread, and lesions from disease. Many died before reaching 30. For those who entered as children, half their lives were already spent by the time they took final vows. Within the monastery, sickness was not exception but part of life. Hunger, cold, and labor ensured its presence. Medicine brought little relief. Death followed closely, leaving only silence and prayer behind. For a child within stone walls, health was fragile and survival never certain. Silence that never lifted. Inside a medieval monastery, silence was not simply custom. It was law. The rule demanded that speech be limited, that words be used only when necessary. For children who entered as novices, the absence of sound was one of the hardest burdens. Days stretched on with only the toll of bells, the murmur of chants, and the echo of footsteps across stone. The cloister was the center of this silence. Covered walkways surrounded a square garden. Novices walked there daily, their eyes lowered, their hands folded, their voices restrained. If one wished to speak, it had to be with gestures, or whispered only when permitted. The walls carried every sound, the rustle of robes, the scrape of sandals, the distant caw of crows. Conversation, once familiar in homes and villages, was gone. Meals deepened the quiet. Monks sat in rows at long wooden tables, heads bowed, hands moving carefully. Bread was broken, beans eaten with spoons, fish pulled apart in silence. The only voice came from a reader at a lectern, reciting scripture in Latin. His words droned steadily while others chewed. No response, no laughter, no comment was allowed. For children, eating became another form of discipline. Dormitories, filled with rows of straw beds, held the same rule. Night carried only the sound of coughing, the turning of bodies, and the whistle of wind through small windows. If a novice whispered, he risked punishment. Even in dreams, silence pressed down, broken only when bells rang for prayer. Work carried quiet as well. In scriptoria, pens scratched against parchment, a rhythm steady and unbroken. In fields, the sound of hoes striking earth and oxen pulling plows replaced voices. Silence was meant to make work itself an act of prayer. For children, it meant long hours without companionship, their thoughts left unspoken. Silence was enforced with correction. The rule of St. Benedict stated that idle words led to sin. Novices who spoke out of turn were rebuked, sometimes beaten, sometimes sent to confess before the community. Gestures replaced language, pointing, nodding, moving hands in small signs. For boys who once shouted in play, the loss was sharp. Loneliness followed. Many novices entered monasteries at young ages, separated from families. Letters were rare, visits rarer still. Without speech, without laughter, the separation grew heavier. Children learned to keep their thoughts inward, to let silence fill spaces where words once lived. The isolation was complete. Even festivals did not break the rule. On feast days, chants grew louder, bells rang longer, and processions filled cloisters. Yet conversation remained forbidden. The joy of celebration came not in laughter, but in ritual. Children stood in crowds, silent among voices raised in song, never free to speak their own. The silence shaped memory. Novices recalled bells more than words, chants more than conversations. Days blurred, each marked by sound only in prayer. The voice became a tool of ritual, not of self. For many, this loss was the heaviest discipline of all. Archaeological remains show how silence was written into life. Monastic rules preserved in manuscripts forbid idle talk. Chronicles mention punishments for novices who spoke without leave. Margins of manuscripts contain small drawings, evidence that boys turned to scribbles when words were denied. These fragments suggest quiet rebellion, moments when silence grew unbearable. Silence was believed to purify. It removed distraction, focused thought, and humbled pride. But for children, it meant isolation. The absence of conversation, of family, of play, pressed heavily. The monastery became a world of voices only in prayer, never in laughter, never in ordinary speech. Within stone walls, silence never lifted. It filled cloisters, dormitories, kitchens, and fields. It surrounded children from dawn until dusk, broken only by bells and chants. For them, life became not sound but its absence, a weight heavier than labor, colder than stone. Childhood taken away. Many who entered monasteries did so not by choice, but by decision of parents. Families gave sons to the church as offerings, or to ease the burden of mouths to feed. Some believed the gift secured blessings. Others sought status by placing a child in holy life. For the children themselves, it meant the loss of family and the loss of childhood. Boys were often sent young. Some arrived at 7, others earlier. They were dressed in plain robes, their hair cut, their old names sometimes replaced with new ones. The world they had known, fields, siblings, parents, the noise of markets was left behind at the monastery gates. Inside, the stone walls closed off memory. Contact with family nearly vanished. Letters were rare, and visits rarer still. Parents might see a child once a year, if at all. Brothers and sisters grew up apart, their lives diverging quickly. For novices, loneliness became constant, sharpened by silence that forbade talk of longing. Family ties faded into memory, replaced by duty. Childhood itself disappeared. Toys, play, and laughter had no place. A novice's days were filled with prayer, work, and correction. Hours that once might have been spent in games were spent copying texts, hauling water, or kneeling in cold chapels. Bells replaced the voices of parents. The abbot became father, monks became brothers, but affection was limited, and comfort rare. Discipline erased much of youth. Mistakes brought lashes or fasting. Idle words brought rebuke. Obedience was demanded, not requested. The energy of children, once expressed in play, was pressed into labor and silence. Childhood curiosity was treated as pride. Novices learned quickly to bow their heads, to move quietly, to erase themselves in order to belong. The loss carried into memory. Men who grew old in monasteries often wrote of entering young, their lives outside barely recalled. Their writings speak not of play, but of rules, not of family, but of obedience. Childhood became a forgotten stage, swallowed by the stone walls that claimed them early. For some, grief lingered. Records mention novices who wept at night, missing mothers or fearing loneliness. Such displays were corrected swiftly, seen as weakness. Tears dried quickly under the weight of correction. Silence replaced cries, and the loss became private. The monastery also reshaped identity. A boy given to the cloister lost his family name in many cases, becoming known by the monastery itself. His past dissolved. He was no longer son or brother, but servant of God. For children, this shift erased the bonds that tied them to the world beyond the walls. Festivals and rituals offered reminders of family, but only in absence. Processions passed through villages, and novices glimpsed families gathered in crowds. Yet they could not join, only observe. Their place remained within the monastery, their ties to the world outside cut. Archaeological remains of toys and games found in villages rarely appear in monasteries. In their place are writing tablets, ink pots, and prayer books. Childhood was stripped of play, replaced by discipline and study. Even small acts of rebellion scribbles in manuscript margins. Carved figures hidden in wood are rare fragments, evidence of children who tried to hold on to what was taken. The loss was not seen as tragedy in the Middle Ages. It was considered sacrifice. To give a child to the church was to give him to God. Yet for the child, the meaning was different. It was a narrowing of life, a surrender of freedom, and the erasure of childhood itself. Within the monastery, children grew quickly into men. Their youth buried in silence, hunger, and obedience. The laughter of family, the warmth of parents, the ease of play, all were taken away, replaced by stone, prayer, and discipline. Childhood ended not with age, but with the closing of the monastery gates. The endless scriptorium. The scriptorium was one of the most demanding spaces within a monastery. It was a room of silence, dimly lit by narrow windows, filled with the steady scratching of pens. For children who entered as novices, it became both classroom and workplace. Hours passed here, repeating the same motions until the body ached and the mind dulled. Manuscripts were copied by hand. Each page began with the preparation of parchment animal skins scraped smooth, stretched, and cut into sheets. Novices carried stacks of skins, heavy and stiff, their smell lingering in the room. Older monks prepared ink from soot, gall, or minerals, mixing it with water. The air smelled of hide and metal, a reminder of the materials that filled the day. Reed pens, cut sharp at the tip, scratched across parchment. Each letter required precision. Mistakes could ruin a page, wasting days of work. For novices, errors were common. Blots of ink, crooked lines, and uneven letters drew correction from teachers. Sometimes punishment followed. A boy who spilled ink might copy pages as penalty, doubling his hours of labor. Light was poor. Windows were narrow, designed to keep out cold rather than let in brightness. Candles were few, their smoke darkening ceilings, their light unsteady. Eyes strained in the gloom, squinting at fine script. Many monks grew nearsighted, their vision weakened by years of copying. Children, too, felt the weight. Their young eyes dimmed before adulthood. The work was repetitive. Psalms, Gospels, and rules of the order were copied again and again. Latin words filled page after page, memorized without meaning. Hours blurred into one another, chants from the chapel blending with the steady scratch of pens. The rhythm dulled thought, leaving only repetition. Silence was enforced. Voices were not permitted, except for brief instructions. Communication came through gestures pointing to ink pots, handing pens, lifting pages. The only sound was the scrape of reeds and the occasional cough. For children, the silence grew heavy, pressing on minds already burdened by discipline. The posture itself was painful. Desks were narrow, benches hard. Hours of leaning forward, bent backs, stiffened necks, and numbed legs. Hands cramped from holding pens tightly. Ink-stained fingers permanently, black lines marking the skin. Novices carried these marks into every other task, their labor etched visibly on their bodies. Illustrated manuscripts brought beauty but demanded even more skill. Novices ground pigments from minerals, lapis for blue, ochre for yellow, vermilion for red. They mixed them with egg whites or oils, painting careful images of saints, vines, or animals. Mistakes in color or form were hard to hide. Hours of grinding, mixing, and applying left wrists sore and minds fatigued. The monotony shaped thought. Novices learned patience but also numbness. Days passed without change, each page like the last. Their childhood energy dissolved into lines of ink, their curiosity confined to margins. Occasionally, scribbles or doodles appear in surviving manuscripts' faces, animals, or crude jokes carved into the edges. These small marks reveal rebellion, the quiet attempts of children to reclaim fragments of play in a life stripped of it. Teachers enforced discipline with rods as well as corrections. A crooked line might bring a blow, a blot of ink a public rebuke. Work was not only about precision but about obedience. The scriptorium trained not only hands but wills, bending children into silence and repetition. Illness spread here too. The cold of stone walls, the damp of winter, and the strain of poor light left bodies weak. Coughs echoed through rooms. Ink dust, soot, and the smell of skins filled lungs. Many fell sick, yet work continued. Pages had to be copied, manuscripts completed. The products of this labor survive gospels, psalters, and rules bound in leather, their letters precise, their decorations bright. Each represents hundreds of hours, much of it by hands of novices. Yet the beauty hides the misery of its making. Behind every page lies a child bent over a desk, eyes straining, back aching, lips silent. The scriptorium consumed youth. It demanded patience, precision, and silence. For children, it meant endless hours repeating words they barely understood, copying lines that blurred together until their childhood dissolved into ink and parchment. Winters of stone and frost. The rhythm of monastic life did not change with the seasons, but the weight of winter pressed more heavily than any rule. Stone walls, already cold, grew colder still. Air seeped through cracks, frost clung to windows, and the ground outside hardened with ice. For children and novices within the cloister, winter meant nights without warmth, days without relief, and work that continued despite the bitter air. Cells offered little protection. Straw pallets absorbed damp, blankets were thin, and robes were the same in summer as in winter. Fires were not permitted in private rooms, only in kitchens or infirmaries. Monks and novices slept fully clothed, their hands tucked into sleeves, their bodies curled tightly for warmth. Breath hung in the air like mist. Each exhalation, a reminder of the cold. Waking before dawn for prayers meant rising into darkness colder than night itself. The chapel did not spare them. Morning prayers began while frost still clung to stone. Candles flickered weakly, their small flames unable to warm vast halls. Voices rose in chant, but lips stiffened and fingers trembled. Some boys dropped their books, their hands too numb to hold them. Punishment followed, for cold did not excuse failure. Discipline required presence, even when bodies shook with chill. Meals brought no comfort. The bread was hard from storage, beans boiled into thick porridge, fish salted and dry. Food was meant to sustain, not to warm. Fires in kitchens provided brief heat, but only to those laboring there. Children carried bowls of steaming broth through icy corridors, their hands burning from heat on one side, freezing on the other. The warmth faded quickly, replaced again by cold stone. Work in winter was as heavy as in summer. Fields required clearing, animals needed feeding, walls demanded repair. Novices trudged through snow to fetch water, their robes soaked and stiff with ice. Tools grew slippery in frozen hands, feet cracked from standing in icy mud, skin splitting at heels and toes. The pain lingered long after work ended, carried into night. Illness thrived in the season. Cough spread quickly through dormitories, their echoes filling the silence of cloisters. Fevers followed, and lungs weakened. Some boys never recovered, their names added to simple records. The infirmary overflowed, yet its fires and herbs could not cure most sickness. Death was more common in winter, when hunger and cold weakened already fragile bodies. The silence of winter was heavier. Snow muffled sound outside. Bells echoed dully against frozen air. Inside, voices lowered. Chants carried more softly. Days shortened, darkness lengthened, and the hours of prayer felt unending. For children, the monotony deepened. Each day identical, each night colder than the last. Festivals brought small relief. At Christmas, extra bread, cheese, and wine were given. Hymns replaced some psalms, and candles burned brighter. Yet even these celebrations carried discipline. Meals were silent, chants were long, and the cold remained. Joy was not free, but controlled, confined within rules. The seasons beyond winter brought their own burdens. Spring meant damp, with rains soaking fields and cloisters alike. Stone walls dripped with moisture, straw beds rotted, and insects returned. Summer brought heat, heavy and suffocating, trapping air within thick walls, sweat-soaked robes, and food spoiled quickly. Autumn demanded harvest, long days in fields carrying grain and storing it for winter. Each season carried labor, each marked by discomfort. Winter, however, remained the harshest. The absence of warmth revealed the fragility of life inside monasteries. For children, the memory of homes with hearth fires, of parents' voices, of blankets thicker than woolen robes, made the stone walls colder still. Those memories faded over years, but the body never forgot the sting of frost on skin, the ache of frozen limbs, or the sound of bells calling them into dark chapels when sleep was needed most. Archaeological traces confirm these hardships. Monastic sites show chimneys only in kitchens, not in cells. Excavated dormitories reveal narrow windows and stone floors. Written chronicles describe winters where monks shivered as they prayed, and novices coughed through the psalms. These records echo the reality preserved in bones children thin, their growth stunted, their deaths clustered in cold months. Winter did not end monastic life, but it stripped it bare. Cold air filled lungs, frost crept into bones, and stone walls pressed the season inward. For those who lived within, especially children, winters were endured, never escaped. Days that were never their own. Life in a medieval monastery followed a schedule that never changed. Bells marked every moment, dividing day and night into strict hours of prayer, work, and silence. For children who entered as novices, there was no choice, no freedom, no time that could be called their own. The body and the mind were given wholly to the rhythm of the cloister. The day began in darkness. Before dawn, the first bell rang. Novices rose from straw beds, shivering in cold air, pulling robes close to their thin bodies. There was no delay, no lingering. They walked silently through corridors, their sandals scraping against stone. The night office, matins, began with chants that lasted hours. Sleep was broken, the body unprepared, yet prayer came first. After matins came lauds, the prayers of dawn. The sky outside grew pale, though little of it entered through narrow windows. Psalms were recited, verses repeated, until the words lost meaning. Only when the chants ended could novices return briefly to their cells. The pause was short, often filled with chores sweeping floors, carrying water, feeding animals. Prime followed soon after, marking the first hour of daylight. Novices filed back into the chapel, voices low, eyes heavy. The pattern repeated with terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at evening, compline at night. 7 times a day, the bell called them, and each call had to be answered. Between these hours, there was little time for rest. Meals were short, taken in silence. Bread, beans, and fish were eaten while scripture was read aloud. There was no conversation, no chance to pause or reflect. As soon as bowls were emptied, work resumed. Kitchens had to be cleaned, gardens tended, fields plowed, or manuscripts copied. The hours were filled, one after another, without release. Manual labor carried its own rhythm. In spring, planting. In summer, weeding. In autumn, harvest. In winter, repairs. Novices carried wood, dug soil, and hauled water. Inside, those assigned to the scriptorium bent over desks, their pens scratching parchment in silence. Work was prayer, and prayer was work. The two blurred together until the day became one long act of discipline. Even the night was divided. After compline, monks and novices returned to their dormitories. They lay down in rows, still clothed, belts fastened, ready to rise again. Sleep came in fragments. The bell would ring for vigils in the middle of the night, dragging them from rest back to the chapel. The body never recovered. The cycle never broke. The schedule erased individuality. There was no time for play, no time for wandering, no space for thought beyond prayer and labor. A novice who slowed, who lingered, who sought a moment of stillness outside the rules was corrected. Obedience demanded that the hours be kept without complaint. Festivals changed little. While feast days brought longer chants and occasional extra food, the structure remained. Bells still rang, prayers were still said, and silence was still enforced. The only difference was in length. The services stretched longer, the hours filled with more ritual. For children, festivals meant more fatigue, not freedom. The monotony was heavy. Each day mirrored the last. Each season followed the same pattern. Years blurred, remembered not by events but by cycles of planting, harvesting, fasting, and prayer. Novices who entered young grew into men without memories of childhood, only of bells and psalms. The loss of freedom extended even to thought. Books read in the scriptorium were chosen by abbots' psalms, scripture, and rules of the order. Curiosity beyond these texts was discouraged. To question was disobedience. To desire was pride. The schedule not only ordered the body, but shaped the mind, pressing all into the same rhythm. Archaeological remains of monasteries confirm this structure. Bell towers stand tall above cloisters, their sound once carrying across fields. Manuscripts list daily prayers, each hour marked carefully. Chronicles describe novices who faltered, who missed hours of prayer, and the punishments they endured. Every fragment of record shows the same truth. Life was divided by bells, without escape. For children, the loss was greatest. Freedom of movement, freedom of play, freedom of speech, all were gone. Their days belonged to the monastery, their hours broken into prayer and labor. The bells tolled, the body obeyed, and the cycle continued. Unchanging, unending. Correction through pain. Obedience was the heart of monastic life, and correction was its tool. Novices, especially children, were shaped by discipline as much as by prayer. The rule of St. Benedict spoke often of obedience, humility, and silence, and punishment was considered necessary to maintain them. Pain was not seen as cruelty, but as instruction. The rod was the most common form of correction. Teachers and senior monks carried sticks, ready to strike hands, backs, or legs when rules were broken. A boy who stumbled in prayer, who let his eyes close from weariness, or who spoke without leave, felt the sting of wood. The blows were not hidden. Punishments were often public, delivered in chapter houses where the community gathered. The offender knelt, confessed, and endured lashes before all. Humiliation reinforced the lesson as strongly as pain. Fasting served as another punishment. A novice might be denied his portion of bread, or sent to eat apart from the community, sitting on the floor while others sat at tables. In severe cases, meals were withheld entirely. Hunger, already familiar in daily life, deepened as a form of correction. The body became the means by which the spirit was taught submission. Isolation was harsher still. A boy who disobeyed repeatedly might be confined to his cell, forbidden from speaking, sometimes denied even the company of prayer. Hours stretched long in such silence, the stone walls pressing inward. For children, this punishment carried fear. For companionship, however limited, was vital. Alone, with only the echo of bells, the mind sank into weariness and dread. Extra labor was also common. A novice might be sent to sweep cloisters until darkness fell, to scrub floors with cold water, or to dig trenches in frozen ground. Work itself was prayer, but when given as punishment, it became burden. Children returned from these tasks with hands blistered, backs aching, their bodies reminders of disobedience. Confession before the community was perhaps the most humiliating. Each morning in chapter, monks gathered to hear faults admitted. A boy who had spoken idly, who had failed to memorize a psalm, or who had shown laziness, stood before all and declared his error. The abbot assigned penance, whether lashes, fasting, or labor. The act of speaking publicly, head bowed, reinforced the lesson more deeply than the punishment itself. Some monasteries used harsher forms of correction. Chronicles mention novices forced to lie prostrate on the ground, arms outstretched, while others stepped over them. Others describe boys whipped until their robes tore. Though such accounts are few, they reveal that severity was not absent. For children, already fragile, such punishments carried scars both physical and unseen. Correction was tied to belief. The rule stated that the abbot must win souls, not break them. Yet the line was thin. Pain was justified as healing, humiliation as guidance. A novice's will was seen as dangerous, prideful, and in need of breaking. To strike the body was to save the soul. Parents who had given sons to monasteries accepted this logic. A boy who suffered within the cloister was believed to serve God more truly. The memory of punishment lingered. Men who grew old within monasteries wrote of rods, of hunger, of silent penance. Some described them without anger, as part of the life they accepted. Others hinted at fear, recalling nights spent alone in cold cells, waiting for bells, dreading correction. The discipline left marks that shaped them long after childhood had passed. Archaeological remains cannot show punishment, but the records of rules, chronicles, and manuscript margins preserve its presence. Notes in the rule mention lashes. Letters describe abbots who corrected too harshly. Small scribbles in texts, faces drawn in margins, animals carved beside letters may reflect quiet rebellion, small resistances against silence and pain. Correction was steady, unavoidable. Every novice knew the weight of the rod, the emptiness of fasting, the burden of extra labor. For children whose bodies and minds were still tender, the monastery offered not gentleness, but discipline. Pain became teacher, silence became penance, and obedience was carved into the body itself. Death in the cloister. Death was as constant in monasteries as prayer or labor. Cold, hunger, and illness carried many away, and for children who entered as novices, the risk was even greater. Few lived long, and those who did carried memories of burials repeated often within the stone walls. When a monk or novice grew weak, he was taken to the infirmary. The room was small, lined with straw beds, lit by narrow windows. The air smelled of herbs, sage, fennel, garlic, mixed with smoke from a single fire. Brothers tended the sick with bowls of broth, prayers whispered over bodies. Remedies were simple: honey spread on wounds, vinegar to wash sores, herbs boiled into teas. Yet cures were few. Fevers lingered, coughs deepened, and bodies wasted away. Death came quietly. A bell tolled when life ended. The community gathered, chanting psalms, their voices steady and low. The body was washed in cold water, wrapped in a plain shroud, and placed on a wooden bier. For children, there was no difference. A novice was buried with the same rites as an elder, his youth unmarked, his years unfinished. The procession moved slowly through cloisters. Monks walked in silence, their eyes lowered, their lips murmuring prayers. The bier was carried to the cemetery beyond the walls, a plot of earth marked with wooden or stone crosses. Graves were shallow, dug quickly by hand. The body was lowered without coffin, the earth filled again, the cross placed above. For children, small mounds marked their passing, soon blending with the others. Death was not mourned with tears, but with ritual. The rule instructed that grief be tempered by faith. To die was to join God, to pass from discipline on earth to eternal order. For families outside, the loss of a child within the cloister was final. Many never knew the day their sons died. Letters rarely reached villages, and news of death often came months late, if at all. The cemetery grew steadily. Rows of graves lined its ground, the markers simple, names often lost to time. Archaeologists uncover these sites, bones thin from hunger, teeth worn from coarse bread, ribs marked by illness. Many skeletons are small, belonging to those who died before manhood. The earth preserves what chronicles record. Death was common, survival uncertain. Inside the monastery, death changed little. Prayers continued. Bells rang, meals were eaten in silence. The dead were remembered briefly in chants, then life resumed. Another novice filled the empty bed. Another hand copied the manuscript. Another voice joined the choir. For children, the lesson was clear. The monastery endured. Individuals did not. Festivals sometimes honored the dead. On All Souls' Day, prayers were offered for those buried in cloisters. Candles burned in chapels. Names were read aloud, though many names were forgotten. The ritual was collective, not personal. Even in death, individuality dissolved into community. The fear of death lingered among novices. Coughs in dormitories, fevers in winter, the sound of shovels in the cemetery, all were reminders. Some boys wept in silence. Others grew numb, watching death repeat without pause. Their childhoods were shaped by this constant presence, by the knowledge that life within stone walls was fragile. Plague deepened the fear. When pestilence entered monasteries, dozens died in days. Graves filled quickly, processions shortened, prayers repeated without end. Chronicles record whole houses emptied, their cloisters left silent, their chapels abandoned. For children, plague meant no chance of survival. Their small bodies claimed first. Yet death was not rebellion. It was woven into the rhythm of the cloister. It came as steadily as bells, as predictably as chants. For novices, it was both threat and certainty, a shadow that never left. Childhood ended early, if not by obedience and labor, then by the grave. Robes of rough wool, clothing in a medieval monastery, was not meant for comfort. It was simple, coarse, and uniform, designed to strip away vanity and remind each monk of poverty. For children who entered as novices, the robes became both identity and burden. The fabric scratched against skin, trapped damp in winter, heat in summer, and never truly offered warmth. The habit was the same for all. A long tunic of wool reached to the ankles, tied at the waist with a cord. Over this came a scapular, a strip of cloth falling front and back, worn during work and prayer. A hooded cowl was added in colder months, its heavy folds draping the shoulders. Shoes were rare. Sandals of leather or wood were worn, though often feet remained bare within cloisters. Nothing differed between child and adult. The smallest novice wore the same cut as the abbot. The wool was coarse. Sheep from monastic fields were shorn, their fleeces spun and woven by hand. The cloth was thick but not soft. It scratched constantly, especially against thin skin. Novices itched beneath robes, their arms and legs marked with red lines. Lice and fleas found easy shelter in the fabric, spreading quickly through dormitories. Washing was rare, as water and labor were precious. Robes grew stiff with sweat, dirt, and smoke from kitchens. In winter, the clothing failed to protect. The wool held little heat against stone walls and frozen air. Monks and novices layered garments when possible, but blankets were few, and cold seeped into every seam. Fingers numbed, toes cracked, and lips split from frost. The cowl offered some cover, but its weight grew heavy on small shoulders. Nights were spent shivering, robes clutched tightly, the body never warm. Summer brought opposite discomfort. Thick wool-trapped heat, soaking with sweat during fieldwork. The cloth clung to skin, heavy and suffocating. Flies gathered on damp fabric, and sores formed beneath folds. Sandals offered little protection from sun-baked earth, burning bare skin. For children, the burden of heat combined with hunger and labor left them faint beneath the Sunday. Uniformity erased individuality. Every novice wore the same, regardless of age, status, or background. The habit marked the loss of self. Clothing no longer expressed family or village, no longer carried color or pattern. It symbolized obedience, humility, and sameness. For a child once dressed in the colors of home, the shift was stark. Robes also carried weight during punishment. A boy forced to fast still wore the same thick habit, heavy against his weakened body. One sent to labor wore it soaked with sweat, dragging at each step. Some punishments even involved removing garments, leaving a novice in thin underclothes before the community, as symbol of shame. Clothing was not protection, but part of discipline. The sandals added to misery. Leather cracked in cold, stiffened in wet, and rubbed raw against heels. In snow, feet froze. In summer, they blistered. Some monasteries forbade shoes entirely, requiring barefoot walks across stone floors and frozen ground. For children, each step cut or burned, yet obedience demanded silence. Monastic rules described clothing with precision. 2 tunics were allowed, no more. A cloak for winter, a scapular for work, sandals when permitted. Simplicity was law. Any sign of luxury, fine wool, colored thread, decorated cord, was forbidden. Novices caught altering garments faced rebuke. Poverty was enforced through the fabric itself. Archaeological remains confirm this austerity. Fragments of woolen cloth, sandals of wood, and simple cords have been recovered from monastic sites. Worn smooth, patched repeatedly, they reflect years of use. No silk, no color, no ornament appears in these finds. The uniformity of dress left traces as plain as the lives it covered. For children, the robes became both shield and prison. They identified them as part of the community, yet stripped them of individuality and comfort. The fabric scratched, the sandals bruised, the cowl weighed down. In heat, they suffocated. In cold, they froze. The habit never changed, season to season, year to year. It was the same on the day they entered as on the day they were buried. The silence of play. Childhood beyond the monastery was filled with noise. In villages, children ran through streets, shouted in fields, and laughed in markets. Within cloister walls, such sounds were absent. For boys who entered as novices, joy was not forbidden outright, but it was quietly erased. Rules, silence, and labor left little space for play, and laughter was treated as a distraction from prayer. The rule of Saint Benedict called for seriousness in all things. Monks were instructed to avoid idle words, idle gestures, and idle amusements. Games were seen as vanity, laughter as weakness. For children, this meant their natural impulses were pressed into silence. Running, shouting, and joking were discouraged. Play was not part of holy life. Novices learned quickly that even small acts of joy brought correction. A smile during prayer, a whispered joke during meals, a laugh in the dormitory all risked rebuke. Punishment might be lashes, fasting, or public confession. The lesson was clear. Joy was indulgence, and indulgence had no place in the cloister. The spaces themselves discouraged play. Cloisters were bare, lined with stone. Gardens grew herbs, not toys. Dormitories held rows of straw pallets, silent and narrow. Kitchens bustled with work, not leisure. Chapels allowed no noise beyond chant. There were no corners for games, no fields for sport, no time left for laughter. Every place was shaped for discipline, not delight. Even festivals offered little. On feast days, chants grew louder, candles brighter, meals slightly larger. But conversation was still forbidden, and laughter still frowned upon. Children might taste honey or fruit, yet the joy of food was muted by silence. Hymns replaced games, prayers replaced play. Celebration remained solemn, its joy structured and restrained. The absence of play left marks. Novices copied manuscripts for hours, bent over desks in silence. Their margins rarely showed doodles, though a few survived faces, animals, small drawings carved into parchment edges. These are fragments of rebellion, traces of boys who tried to hold on to play in secret. Yet even these small acts risked punishment if discovered. The weight of silence pressed on spirits. Children who once knew noise grew quiet. Their voices lowered, their laughter faded, their steps slowed. Over time, the impulse to play weakened. Obedience demanded that they erase it from themselves. They grew into men without memory of games, their childhood absorbed by stone walls. Some monasteries allowed music beyond chants. Novices learned to play flutes or pipes, but even this was structured. Notes were taught for hymns, not for songs of joy. Instruments accompanied prayer, not amusement. What might have been play became another form of discipline, another act of worship. Archaeological traces reveal little of play within monasteries. Unlike village sites, where toys, balls, and carved animals are found, monastic excavations yield almost none. The absence itself is telling. Where children lived in cloisters, they left behind no toys, only manuscripts, tools, and fragments of robes. Their play was taken from them, their joy replaced by silence. The contrast with life outside was sharp. Novices who once played in fields with siblings lost that part of themselves at the gates. Their families might have continued games in villages, but the boys inside grew without them. Separation from family meant separation from play. and the monastery enforced it with rules and correction. Laughter was not wholly absent. Quiet smiles appeared in rare moments, in kitchens, perhaps, or in brief glances exchanged during work, but these were fleeting, hidden, and quickly suppressed. The sound of a child's laugh, once natural and frequent, became rare, almost forbidden. Silence filled its place, a silence deeper than stone. In time, novices forgot play altogether. They moved through cloisters as men long before their youth ended. Their voices echoed in chants, never in laughter. Their days belonged to prayer and labor, their nights to silence and sleep. Joy was not part of life, and childhood ended the moment the monastery gates closed. Lessons without light. Education in monasteries was not designed for joy, curiosity, or freedom. It was strict, narrow, and unending, tied entirely to prayer, scripture, and obedience. For children who entered as novices, the promise of learning often became another burden. The classroom was as cold and silent as the chapel, and knowledge was pressed into them with the same weight as discipline. The subjects were few. Latin came first. For prayers, psalms, and scripture were all in that tongue. Boys who entered the cloister often spoke only the language of their village. Latin words sounded strange, heavy, and foreign. Teachers drilled them through repetition, forcing novices to recite lines until their lips knew them by memory. Meaning mattered less than sound. To chant correctly was more important than to understand. The Psalter served as the primer. Children traced its words on wax tablets, copying letters again and again. The Latin alphabet was scratched into surfaces, mistakes scraped away with knives. Hands cramped, eyes strained, and patience frayed. Yet there was no relief, for every line had to be perfect. If a boy faltered, if he confused a letter, the rod corrected him quickly. Scripture filled every lesson. The Gospels, the Psalms, the rule of Saint Benedict, these were copied, recited, and memorized. Stories of saints were added, not as tales of wonder, but as moral lessons. Heroes were martyrs, their courage shown in suffering. For children, these stories reinforced discipline, obedience even unto death, silence even in pain. Joy was absent. Arithmetic was taught, but only enough to keep monastic accounts. Novices learned to tally crops, calculate fasts, and measure tithes. Geometry entered through practical tasks, dividing fields, drawing lines for cloister walls. The lessons were not for curiosity, but for use. Knowledge was a tool of the monastery, not of the child. Music formed part of learning, but only in chant. Boys were trained to sing psalms in unison, their voices blending into one. Notes were taught from memory, not from written scales, for notation was still new. Mistakes were heard at once, corrected by sharp looks or blows. The goal was not expression, but uniformity. Books were rare, parchment was costly, manuscripts copied slowly by hand. Only teachers handled them freely. Novices saw them in lessons, sometimes allowed to hold them under close watch. Most learning came through recitation, through endless repetition of words spoken aloud. Memory became the true library, and the weight of it pressed heavily on young minds. The schoolroom was bare, benches of wood, desks of stone or simple planks, walls unadorned. Cold air seeped through narrow slits of windows. Candles burned dimly, their smoke stinging eyes. The scratching of pens, the murmur of recitations, the coughs of the sick, these were the only sounds. The room was a place of silence and endurance, not curiosity. Punishment was constant. A boy who forgot a line was struck. One who whispered to his neighbor was made to kneel for hours. Mistakes in copying led to lashes, ink spilled on parchment to humiliation. Teachers believed that discipline sharpened learning, that pain carved memory deeper. For novices, education became fear, not discovery. The pace was slow, yet relentless. Children spent years memorizing psalms before moving to more complex texts. A single manuscript might take months to copy, each letter traced carefully. Progress was measured not in joy, but in endurance. A novice who mastered texts did not celebrate, for another book awaited, another psalm to memorize, another chant to perfect. Sleep was often sacrificed. Boys studied by candlelight after compline, their eyes heavy, their hands trembling. Mistakes grew more frequent, as fatigue deepened, leading only to further correction. The cycle repeated daily, without pause. Outside knowledge was barred. Ancient texts of science, philosophy, and poetry sometimes entered monasteries, but most were locked away. Teachers selected only what reinforced obedience and devotion. Novices who asked questions beyond their lessons risked rebuke. Curiosity was seen as pride, and pride as sin. Learning was not freedom, but another form of submission. Archaeological remains confirm this narrowness. Wax tablets with repeated alphabets, fragments of psalters, and marginal notes show the weight of repetition. Few signs of wider knowledge appear in novice training. Chronicles written by monks describe their own childhood's cold classrooms, strict teachers, endless psalms. Their words echo the monotony, the absence of joy. Education in monasteries stripped away the wonder of childhood. It gave boys tools, Latin words, psalms, chants, but denied them play, exploration, or thought beyond obedience. The classroom, like the chapel and the dormitory, was another place where individuality was erased. For children, lessons were not light, but shadow. They carried words they did not fully understand, copied texts they did not choose, and learned discipline more than knowledge. The promise of education became another weight, pressing them into silence, shaping them into obedience, and leaving little of childhood behind. The cloister walls still stand in ruins across Europe. Stones worn by centuries of footsteps, chapels hollowed by time, and graveyards where names have faded to earth. Within those walls, children once rose in darkness, chanted through hunger, labored in silence, and surrendered themselves to a rhythm that allowed no freedom. Their voices were shaped into psalms, their hands into tools, their bodies into obedience. What remains are fragments, books copied by tired eyes, rules written in firm hands, and bones buried beneath the soil of monastic fields. These traces remind us that devotion was bound to discipline, and that childhood ended where cloister gates closed. As you drift now into rest, let the bells fade softly in your mind. If you wish to wander further into forgotten histories, told gently, without hurry, then remain with us. Subscribe, and join us again.